Hey, City Light, good to be here with you on Easter. If you are new here, you're in good company. So am I. So I'd love to meet with you, connect with you a little later. We are going to go to the Easter story today, but we're going to kind of take a roundabout way to get there, and we'll hit up there at the end. So bear with us in that. And today, Jesus is alive. He's risen. The weather's going to be beautiful. You probably have Easter traditions that you do. It's going to be a great day. I don't know if maybe some of you go to mom and dad's or grandma and grandpa's, have a meal together. Maybe there's an Easter egg hunt. Maybe it's a walk. Maybe it's a bike ride. I grew up loving to ride bikes, and our family would go and we'd ride bikes around. And I remember one time our family traveled to some friends, but we didn't take our bikes with us. And so me and my older brother were hanging out with their family. They had two boys about the same age, and we decided we were going to go on a bike ride too, except we didn't have our bikes. So they said, well, you can use our parents' bikes. That's fine. Well, they had their dad's bike and their mom's bike, and my older brother, guess which bike he gets? Their dad's bike, right? And I'm looking at their mom's bike, and this thing looks like it hasn't been ridden in years. It's a little shady, and I'm kind of looking at it, wondering if the wheels are even going to get aired up, like all the things on that. And the friend who's offering it says, hey, don't worry, just trust me, you'll be fine, right? Remember those words. So we go out and we're riding around. Well, this is also the time where the X Games were kind of taking off. And so we decided we were going to kind of join in the same X Game adventure that was happening on TV because, of course, we could pull it off, right? So we built a jump and a ramp on the bottom of their driveway. They had a driveway that kind of curved around at the bottom. We thought it was the perfect spot to put a ramp. So we started hitting this ramp on our bikes. Things were going amazing. I was kind of a little timid in hitting the ramp. And so finally I thought, this is my chance. I'm going to go big. And I remember going down that hill, and I'm on this white wobbly bike, and I'm thinking, this is going to be awesome. And I hit the ramp, and I go up in the air. My bike goes up in the air. My bike seat goes up in the air. And I remember in midair thinking, this is not awesome, as I see my bike seat flying past me. Now, I don't know if you've ever seen a bike seat without a seat, but it kind of looks a little something like this. And so now I'm in the air trying to navigate my landing on this. And it did not work out so well. Fortunately, we had put the ramp just in front of the garage, so I landed and smashed into the garage door and dropped to the ground. And my friends were laughing, my brother's laughing. Just trust me, it'll be fine, right? Now, there is somebody we can trust. We want to talk a little bit about that. We read through part of the story already earlier, but if you have your Bibles, turn to John chapter 11 this morning. And just to get a little more context to this story, we're going to start in verse 1. John chapter 11, verse 1 says this. Now, a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. Verse 3, so the sisters sent to him saying, Lord, he whom you loved is ill. He whom you love is ill. So what's happening? We meet this guy named Lazarus. He's sick. We don't know a ton about him other than Jesus would travel through Bethany often. And as he would travel through there, he would stay at the home of Lazarus and Mary and Martha. They were close friends to him. And so close that even though there's a hit out on Jesus right now, they would ask him to come back to Bethany, a place that was dangerous for him. And so they sent a messenger to go get him. You couldn't text in that day, right? You couldn't even page Jesus back then, right? So they send either a letter as a message, or they often would tell somebody a message. They would go find the person in the other town they're looking for, share that message, and then come back. So that's what's probably taking place right now. And John is telling us that there is something really bad that's starting to go on. Lazarus is sick. The situation's getting real. Jesus' dear friend is ill. What's Jesus going to do? John 10:40 also gives us a little picture into this setting. Jesus has crossed over the Jordan. He's away from Jerusalem. And it's Lazarus and his sisters are back in Bethany. That's only about 1.5 miles away from Jerusalem. Jerusalem's a place where the Jewish leaders had just tried to stone Jesus. So for him to go back there, it would be a big deal. And not only that, Jesus is probably about under 3 months, just for a little time reference, from the place where he's going to be hung on the cross. So to say things are heating up in the beginning of the story is an understatement. But it's there that we go on to verse 4. And when Jesus heard this, he said, "This illness does not lead to death, for it is for the glory of God, so that the Son of God may be glorified through it." Such an interesting statement. This illness does not lead to death. Another translation says, this sickness will not end in death. Remember this. It makes me wonder what Mary and Martha would have thought once they got the message back from Jesus and heard what he had said. Now, there's going to be a lot of things that unfold through this, but keep that in mind. This whole thing, Jesus says, is going to be done to glorify God by giving glory to his Son. There's a purpose within this. In fact, I'm going to give you 3 things today that show us that what Jesus is at work in through this passage and remind us what the resurrection does for us. And the first thing is this. Jesus is always purposeful. Did you get that? Write that down. Jesus is always purposeful. Jesus is never not doing something with intentionality and purpose. That's so unlike you and I, isn't it? Sometimes my wife will say, "What are you doing?" And I just find myself going, "I have no clue. I'm just doing nothing," right? Why are you doing that? I just thought I would. I do so many things without purpose. But Jesus does everything with intense purposefulness. I don't think I can say that 10 times. He's always doing things on purpose. And this is true in this story, and it's true in our lives as well, and the things that we walk through. The next 2 verses that we enter into, though, are some of the most puzzling verses when I first read through this. Verse 5. Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he heard Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place where he was. Such an interesting statement. Did you catch that? There's a Greek word in there, un. It means therefore. It's at the very beginning of verse 6. It's translated in this translation, so. Jesus loved Mary and Martha and Lazarus. Therefore, what's he do? So he stays in the place he was for 2 more days. What? Does this make sense? Why would he do this? Lazarus is really sick. His sisters are worried. Jesus cares so much so that it says he loves them, and because he loves them, he stays there 2 days longer. What in the world is happening? Imagine with me, you have somebody in your family that's deeply sick, and your family friend is your doctor, but they're specialized in such a way that they're the only one that can write whatever prescription that is needed for your family member. And your family member gets to a really dire point, but you realize that the doctor is away. He's on vacation, so you call and you explain the situation. Hey, my family member is not doing well. They need the prescription. You can only write it. You have to be here to do it, right? And so you get the point across. You hang up the phone, and what do? You expect them to be back on the next flight they can get home with. But instead, they just extend their vacation, and they stay 2 days longer. Does that make any sense? But remember, Jesus is always purposeful. So what continues to happen? Verse 7. After he stays 2 days longer, then after this, he said to the disciples, "Let us go to Judea again." So now he's going to Judea. Judea is that region where Bethany's at, where Jerusalem's at. Why didn't he go immediately? Why did he wait 2 days? Maybe is the next verse a part of this clue? Verse 8, the disciples said to him, "Rabbi, the Jews are just now seeking to stone you. Are you going there again?" This is a dangerous place, Jesus. Why in the world would you want to go? The situation is bad. You've got a friend that's really sick, but it just got worse. The friend that's really sick lives by the people that are trying to kill you. But Jesus isn't saying, "No, you're right, it's too dangerous. I'm not going to go." Instead, he goes on in verse 9 and 10, and he tells them this interesting statement about 12 hours being in the day and walking in the light of day so you don't stumble, because if you walk at night, you're going to stumble. There's a lot of interpretations on what he means by this statement. But I think we can look back at chapter 8, verse 12 for a little clue to this. John chapter 8, verse 12 says, "I am the light of the world. Whoever follows me will not walk in darkness, but will have the light of life." I am the light of the world. Remember back in this time, there's no clocks. There's no minutes that are ticking by. They would maybe have a sundial that would be sectioned up into 8 different lines, segments throughout the daylight. So throughout the daylight, you would know how much time you had before night came. And so maybe this is where Jesus is trying to say, hey, you can blaze your own trail. You can try and do your own thing, but you'll be walking in the dark. But Jesus, he's the light. If you walk with him, if you follow him, that's how you'll know where to go. And not only that, Jesus understands his time on earth is limited. And he's deeply purposeful, incredible, intentional, fierce intentionality to what he's living and doing. So Jesus says, all right, it's go time. We're going back. He's not scared for his life. He's willing to risk that. But then in verse 11, he says his friend Lazarus has fallen asleep. So he has to go wake him up, which is so bizarre. And that's why his disciples are even more confused. Jesus, do we need to check the water you're drinking? What's going on here? But then why in the world would we go and risk our lives to wake someone up? And Jesus clarifies it in verse 14 by saying, Lazarus isn't asleep, he's dead. Can things get any worse? Things have gone from bad to worse to now seemingly impossible. What is going to happen at this point? Verse 14. So then Jesus told them plainly, Lazarus has died, and for your sake, I was glad I was not there. If we just stop the story right here, it seems really cruel, doesn't it? If we stop in the middle of the story and we don't go to the end, it seems like God is this mean God that's distant, cruel, uncaring, that somehow takes delight in our struggle and in our sorrow. That's an easy perspective to have if we just look at things from our perspective. But God has a different perspective. God has a bigger perspective. In fact, it reminds me of a story when I was with my kids. We'd found this incredible maze, kind of like the corn maze thing you do in the fall, only this thing was legit. You walked into it, and the maze went all the way to the ground and up about 8 foot, so there was no way you could look over top. It had mirrors, it had tunnels, it was an incredible maze. In fact, you could get lost in this thing for hours. And so we're walking around, we're trying to find our way out, and the only hope we have is we see this thing sticking out in the middle on the top. And we thought maybe if we can get to that tower, we could get up and see how to get out of this thing. Probably they put it up after too many parents emailed saying, we can't get out of the maze, right? We need something. So we climb up the steps. We finally get to this tower, and we climb up the steps, and we look. And we see all the kids and families crying because they can't get out of the maze. But we also see, off in the distance, the way out. We see that where things are leading to and how to get out. And it reminded us that sometimes in the chaos and in the middle of a maze of life, that we have to sometimes, when things seem impossible, get a higher perspective. Sometimes in the middle of the maze of this life, when things seem impossible, you have to get a higher perspective, not one that you can have, but one from a God that is purposeful, that is intentional. Just because I don't understand how God is working in something doesn't mean that God's not working. Corrie ten Boom said this, never be afraid to trust an unknown future to a known God. Because often, trust starts in the place where our questions begin, doesn't it? Trust is that moment of saying there's a God that knows more than me. Remember, Jesus lives with fierce intentionality, so he doesn't stop there. He was glad that he was not there. Why? Verse 15, and for your sake I was glad that I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him. If you circle stuff in your Bible, circle that word believe. It's going to show up 9 more times before our story ends. So, verse 17, he goes on. Now when Jesus came and he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb 4 days, Bethany was near Jerusalem, about 2 miles off, and many of the Jews had come to Martha and Mary to console them concerning their brother. So Lazarus has already been in the dead 4 days. And there's this ancient Jewish myth that taught that if you were in the grave for 3 days, the spirit still hovered around you. But by the 4th day, you were dead. Basically, by the 4th day, you could start to sense the decomposition, and you could smell that the death was there. You could see the death was there. So maybe Jesus had waited 4 days to squash this myth. So nobody could say, hey, Somehow he was still alive. Verse 20 goes on to say this. So when Martha heard that Jesus was coming, she went out to meet him. But Mary remained seated in the house. And Martha said to Jesus, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Martha hears that Jesus is coming. And Jesus, if only you had been here, my brother wouldn't have died. Have you ever felt like God's let you down? That he's been late, that he's missed something, that he didn't come through on his promise? Do you ever have any of those if-onlys? If only I was in a different family. If only I looked different. If only this situation worked out this way. Or if only this situation hadn't happened. If only it was a different circumstance. If only God had answered the prayers the way that I'm asking for them. Isn't it interesting with our if-onlys, we kind of assume that we have the best plan. Somehow we know better than God how things should work out. Lord, if only you had been here. I wonder if you have any if-onlys that you're struggling with right now. Maybe you feel trapped in a situation, but here's the hope. God is not bound by your if-onlys. God has a bigger plan and a bigger perspective. She believes that Jesus is powerful enough that he could have done something about it. She chose a tremendous amount of belief. She mourns. She's hurting. She knows when the messenger came back to them that Jesus had gotten the message, and she knows how long it had taken Jesus to get there. But look what she goes on to say in verse 22. But even now I know that whatever you ask from God, God will give you. Jesus said to her, your brother will rise again. And Martha said to him, I know that he will rise again in the resurrection on the last day. Jesus said to her, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me, though he die, yet shall he live. And everyone who lives, believes in me, shall never die. Do you believe this? She said to him, yes, Lord, I believe you are the Christ, the Son of God, who is coming into the world. N.T. Wright says that Jesus is challenging her to exchange her if only for if Jesus. If Jesus is who he says he is, then that changes everything. Martha is standing there, not with just another human being, but with God in the flesh. Martha is standing there with Jesus, who is there now, the resurrection and the life, the new creation just bursting forth in her presence, the fullness of life found in him. So much so that the resurrection of the dead and salvation are embodied in Jesus. He is the resurrection and the life. It's not a future theology, it's a present person. And she's speaking to him. And yet in his deity, as she's processing, he processes with her. He breaks through the cultural barriers between the teacher and the woman, and he enters into this and engages this incredible theological discussion with her. And Martha responds. She confesses her belief, and she goes to get her sister Mary, verse 32. Now when Mary came to where Jesus was and saw him, she fell at his feet, saying to him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. When Jesus saw her weeping, the Jews who had come with her also weeping, he was deeply moved in his spirit and greatly troubled. And he said, where have you laid him? And they said to him, Lord, come and see. Verse 35, Jesus wept. So the Jews said, see how he loved him. But some of them said, could not he have opened the eyes of the blind man, also have kept this man from dying? Incredible response in this. Martha and Mary both came with the same statement, but Jesus uniquely meets each one where they're at. In fact, not only is Jesus always present or always purposeful, but he is actively present. Did you get that? Jesus is actively present. He's here with these women in their situation, talking to them through unique situations they're both dealing with, through the ways they're both processing it. Mary has just come with grief, falling at his feet, weeping. Pain so deep it takes her off her feet. She doubles over. She can feel the grief in every part of her body. And watch Jesus do this. Blows me away. He knows how the story ends. He could have just said at that point, Mary, Don't cry. He's going to be okay. He could have said, Lazarus, come forth. But instead, the God of the universe stops and sits and cries with her. The God of the universe is actively present with her. Jesus leads the way, and he calls us to enter into the pain with others. I've done this at times well, and at times I've failed miserably at this. But Jesus never fails at this. Jesus is always actively present. He knows what's going to happen, and he enters into the grief. As a wise man once said, it was Austin, his sovereignty does not comprise his sympathy or compromise his sympathy. His sovereignty doesn't compromise his sympathy. Another way of saying it was his sympathy comes from his sovereignty. This is the kind of God that he is. He cares. He's deeply moved. God is no stranger to pain. He's actively present in it. In fact, Jesus has experienced more pain than you and I will ever understand or know. And yet, even in this, he is moved by our pain. He sympathizes with our pain. Good stories still have pain. But in the middle of a hard story, it looks different when you know how the story ends. Some people are watching this and they're moved by his presence. Others doubted his power. So Jesus heads to the tomb where Lazarus is in verse 38. And Jesus was deeply moved again, and he came to the tomb. And it was a cave, and a stone lay up against it. And Jesus said, "Take the stone away." And Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, "Lord, by this time there will be an odor, for he has been dead 4 days." And Jesus said to her, "Did not I tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone, and Jesus lifted up his eyes and said, "Father, I thank you that you have heard me. I know that you always hear me, but I said this on the account of other people standing around, that they may believe that you sent me." And when he had said these things, he cried out with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out." And the man who had died came out, his hands and feet bound with linen strips, his face wrapped with a cloth. And Jesus said to them, "Unbind him and let him go." This leads to another point. Not only is Jesus always purposeful, not only is Jesus actively present, but Jesus is all powerful. Jesus holds the power. Now, twice we've seen this word deeply moved, once in 38 and previously in verse 33. And it's this Greek word that has this definition: to sternly charge or to threaten to enjoin, aka to open a can, right? To throw down. What is Jesus so perturbed by? What is he getting worked up by? It's not a who, it's a what? A death. It's this picture of this horse snorting, getting angry. Or maybe for you and I, it's this bull that's snorting and starting to paw its hoof, and you know you got to get out of there. Jesus is charged up because of death. He sees what his perfect creation has become: the pain, the sickness, the devastation. And Jesus is not powerless. He's powerful. But Jesus is also purposeful. And after a prayer and with a loud voice, Jesus shows his power. Augustine said this: Jesus had to call out Lazarus by name because if he hadn't, all the dead would have come out of their graves. This is the God of power that is not limited by anything that you and I see, nothing we face. Can you imagine this moment for these sisters? They've been in deep grief. Jesus calls out their brother, and he comes out, not walking as a zombie, fully alive. The disappointment, the confusion, the devastation, the loss, now fully absorbed in life of their brother being resurrected. Who is this Jesus? He had risked his life to come back and raise his friend from the dead. But Lazarus still had to come back into a broken world. Lazarus would one day die again. But this Jesus that's powerful, he has a different story. Verse 45. Many of the Jews, therefore, who had come with Mary and had seen what he did, believed in him. But some of them went to the Pharisees and told them what Jesus had done. And the chief priests and Pharisees gathered the council and said, "What are we to do? For this man performs many signs. If we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him. And the Romans will come and will take away both our place and our nation." So these Jewish leaders are worked up. They're worked up that Jesus has taken the spotlight. They're worried about their position and their power. They would rather be in control than let the God of the universe take control. Not like you and I. We aren't that way, right? We wouldn't rather be in control than to follow God's plan and let him be in control. So the chief priest, Caiaphas, speaks up and he says this in verse 50. It is better for you that one man should die for the people and not the whole nation should perish. He did not say this on his own accord, but being a high priest that year, he prophesied that Jesus would die for the nation. And not for the nation only, but also to gather into one the children of God who are scattered abroad. From that day on, they made plans to put him to death. So far, our plans to carry out, we're going to kill this Jesus. Rather than sacrifice their place with the nation or the power position, they want to take Jesus out. But Jesus is purposeful, and he uses even that to accomplish his mission on earth. It's incredible. They didn't kill Jesus because Jesus was powerless. Little did they know that he went to die on the cross, not forced, but on his own accord. Not begrudgingly, but willingly. Because this is not the end of the story. 1 Corinthians 15 says this, that Jesus rose from the dead, conquering sin and death. Easter means that Jesus got so worked up about the enemy of death that he defeated it. Easter means that he brings resurrection and life. This is what Martha was being told in verse 26. For those who believe, death is no longer holding power over them. For those who believe, verse 25 tells us that through death we will actually live an eternity with him. Lazarus came out of the grave with his grave clothes on. When Jesus rose from the dead, he left his grave clothes in there. He wasn't going to need them anymore. He offers us eternal life by simply believing in him, recognizing our sin, that we're dead in our sin, and putting our trust in him. So this morning, for those of you that are hearing this story, maybe for the first time, what would keep you from putting your faith and trust in Jesus right now, right where you sit? For others, maybe in this room, you put your faith in Jesus years ago, but you've forgotten the incredible power that he continues to display. The way that he is working in the lives of others around us and invites you to be a part of that. Not just helping people in little ways, but resurrecting people dead in their sins, not just kind of dead, fully dead. Ephesians 2 tells us this. You were dead in the trespasses of your sins. You were by nature children of wrath, like the rest of mankind, but God, rich in mercy, because of his great love with which he loved us, even when you were dead in our trespasses, he made us alive together with Christ. By grace you have been saved, now raised up with him. Maybe you're like a skeptical onlooker. You're doubting Jesus' power. You're trying to hold on to control. You feel like no one could forgive you of what you've done in the past. Maybe you feel like you've done too much. Maybe you feel like you haven't done enough, and Jesus is inviting you. Because remember the message that Jesus' sister had sent to him? Their confidence was not based on the fact that Lazarus loved Jesus. Their confidence was based on the fact that Jesus loved Lazarus. Lazarus didn't do anything to gain Jesus' love. Lazarus didn't do anything to be resurrected. He was dead. But Jesus had his power. And that's true of all of us. He can change our life. We're not just sick and need a little help. We're not just dead. We are dead in need of resurrection. And maybe you see that throughout your life. Maybe your marriage is struggling. It's not just needing a little help. It needs Jesus' resurrection power. Maybe you're stuck in an addiction and you need Jesus' resurrection power. Maybe your pride continues to erode your life. You need Jesus' resurrection power because Jesus loved Lazarus and Mary and Martha. He let him die. Why? To display his power so that they'd believe. So the disciples would believe. So others around him would believe. Because he realized that apart from God, there is no life. There's nothing that will compare to him. So I wonder, do you believe this? Do you believe this is true? Luke chapter 24 gives us a final picture of this. In verse 1, it says this. But on the first day of the week, at early dawn, they went to the tomb, taking up spices they had prepared, and they found the stone rolled away from the tomb. But when they went in, they did not find the body of the Lord Jesus. While they were perplexed about this, behold, two men stood by them in dazzling apparel. And they were frightened and bowed their faces to the ground. The men said to them, "Why do you seek the living among the dead? He is not here, but he is risen. Remember how he told you while he was in Galilee that the Son of Man must be delivered in the hands of sinful men and be crucified, and on the third day rise." They remembered his words, and returning to the tomb, they told all these things to the 11 and to all the rest. Now it was Mary Magdalene and Joanna and Mary the mother of James and other women with them who told these things to the apostles. But these words seemed an idle tale, and they did not believe them. Typical men right there, right? Verse 12, and Peter rose up and he ran to the tomb, and stooping in and looking, he saw the linen cloths by themselves, and he went home marveling at what had happened. Even though the disciples had just witnessed this incredible story, they still doubted. They still struggled to believe. Maybe in your life right now, you have things happening, the seat's flying off, the wheels are coming off. Maybe it's all falling apart. But know this, Jesus is at work in your story. Know that he sees your hurt and his heart hurts too. He doesn't mess up, but he does work in the mess. And Jesus is not powerless. He is deeply personal and deeply purposeful. Today we don't celebrate Lazarus rising from the dead. Lazarus died again. Today we don't have a funeral for Jesus because Jesus rose from the grave, displayed his power. And that's not something you need to trust me with. Believe me, that's something you can trust Jesus.